Thank you very much. Thank you to the organisers as well for what has been a fascinating and fantastic conference so far. Before I start, I'll just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal and Wangal lands in Sydney's inner west, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm coming from. Now, before I start, I need to stress that I'm not a digital content producer in any way, shape or form. I'm an archaeologist and educator. So what I wanted to do with this presentation was to give you an example of or a case study of some of the side effects of engaging with visualizations that we didn't necessarily expect when we first began the process of creating a VR model of the excavations that I'm involved in Cyprus. And this is really in terms of broader promotion of the project, and also in terms of educational outreach. So I just want to give you some experiences from our perspective in terms of what a positive and beneficial experience it's been for us overall. So I'm going to begin by taking you to Cyprus, the easternmost island in the Mediterranean Sea, and down on the very southwest corner to a town called Paphos, or Nea Paphos as it was known in antiquity, the capital of the island in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. And since 1995, the University of Sydney and our Pathosphere Theatre Archaeological project has been slowly excavating and uncovering the architecture of a theatre that was used for performances and spectacles for more than, pardon me, for more than 6.5 centuries in antiquity, as well as eventually uncovering, and understanding the urban infrastructure surrounding that theatre, which includes significant Roman roads, colonnades, nymphaeum, and various other pieces of public infrastructure, and seeing that evolution throughout the 6 centuries. The theatre itself is located right in the very northeastern corner of the ancient city, again, surrounded by modern developments and modern construction. But what's been interesting is that we've been through the process of excavation, understand continuity on the site from the 4th century BC right through until today, and indeed some of the farmhouses that were occupied right up until the 1960s, descendants of the inhabitants of those houses now live in Melbourne. So one of the interesting perspectives, of course, is having worked on this same project for more than 25 years now, we also began as an analog project in a whole range of areas, from both field recording through to photography. So we've also got that really interesting dichotomy of heritage data and legacy data, which is still analog, at the same time that we're currently capturing new material using digital formats as well. So trying to gain that balance of marrying historical results from the project with more contemporary ones has been interesting. But the Paphos Theatre Archaeological project itself is run out of the University of Sydney. We work in conjunction with the Department of Antiquities in the Republic of Cyprus, and we are supported by the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens and by the Chowchak Wing Museum, where I work at the University of Sydney, formerly the Nicholson Museum's collection. So we have, over the past years, attempted a number of ways of capturing and recording information about the site itself. It's a large site. Anyone who's ever been to an ancient Greek theatre will get a sense of the size and scale. The theatre itself is almost 100 metres from side to side. And so, you know, among the ways that we've been capturing it digitally has been our surveyor, Guy Hazel's image that you see here, which is more than 6,000 images captured on a pole camera, stitched together using Agisoft. And from that, of course, Guy has then been able to create some 3D models of the site. We've also done similar using drone images of the site and surrounding areas as well. We also worked with the Cypress Institute more than a decade ago now. So very early in terms of the process of any attempt of this type of information gathering on Cyprus. But what's interesting about this, and actually echoing one of the things that Michael just said, that the Cypress Institute recorded on the site in between our excavation seasons when the site was heavily overgrown. And one of the interesting things is, of course, not just the development of technology in that intervening decade, but also just how that overgrowth really resulted in a lack of clarity of some of the imaging at that time. Now, again, conscious that some of these videos may not work over Zoom, but just to give you a very brief overview of how they captured the theatre at that point in time, as opposed to what we ourselves achieved more recently. And again, obviously, we've excavated considerably more of the site since this was done as well. They themselves have done considerable work in capturing frescoes and paintings of Byzantine and medieval churches throughout Cyprus. Okay, so I'll move on, but you'll just get a sense that you know of how much that clarity has improved over time. But one of the reasons why I and the team wanted to engage with VR in particular, but trying to find methods of capturing visualizations of the site, was that we had a number of real life problems that were constant and consistent throughout the excavation. And we thought that this style of visualization would be a way of us actually being able to arrest some of those issues. The first one, of course, is the state of preservation of the site itself. That unlike many theatres that may have come to minds of people that have travelled in places like Ephesus or Epidaveros that are incredibly well preserved, the theatre site at Paphos is in a terrible state. It was finally destroyed by earthquake in the 4th century CE. And what's interesting is that considerable amount of stonework and architectural features were robbed from the theatre and used elsewhere in and around Paphos, and in particular a nearby Christian basilica. So one of the things is that the site itself is in terrible state. So to be able to recreate a sense of the grandeur of what it looked like in antiquity from a modern perception where it's not particularly visible. The other one is also understanding the architectural history of the site. And during the process of excavation, we've been able to uncover at least 6 phases throughout that 6 centuries of use of the space. And so, this is a chance to actually demonstrate visually just how much the theatre building itself changed throughout its history as a result of that process of renovation and extension. Then there was also the political issue of reconstruction. Now, the theatre at Paphos is one of 5 ancient theatres and Odeon located on the island of Cyprus, and all 4 of the other theatres were reconstructed during the 1960s and 1970s. So what is interesting is that, and particularly once we started publishing that we knew that the theatre itself would have seated more than 8,500 spectators in antiquity, there was incredible political pressure on the Department of Antiquities to actually restore and rebuild the theatre for modern performances. And one mayor of the town in particular, every time I spoke with him, you could see dollar signs in his eyes. So part of this was to demonstrate, well, and setting aside all of the ethical and other issues associated with reconstruction from a 21st century perspective, but one of the key issues was, okay, if you are going to finance the restoration of the theatre, which theatre are you choosing to do so? Because once you choose one, you are destroying all evidence of other phases of that structure. So the opportunity to actually show various models of the theatre throughout time. Another issue called site accessibility, that it's an unsafe site, even when we're working there, but particularly when we're not. So it's not able to be open to the public at this point in time. So how can we get people to actually engage with it without the opportunity to actually go and walk on the site? And then, as I mentioned before, of course, our commitment to public engagement and public education. So in 2017, I commercially arranged for Lithodomus to get involved with the project. And I know that many of you would have heard Simon Young's presentation yesterday afternoon. That process of collaboration has been incredibly fruitful from our perspective. But one of the interesting things was that process of working collaboratively in terms of demonstrating, or in terms of working out the best processes to take in terms of a VR model. And the decision was made that we would focus on the Antonine phase of the theatre's reconstruction. This is a phase of which we have considerable amount of architectural and archaeological evidence. I'll skim through it very quickly, but just in terms of the sheer size and scale of imported Roman marble, a whole range of capitals and columns that have ended up in other parts of the site that again could be scanned and used. And again, fragmentary, but at least an indication of the decorative scheme of the two-story stage building as it appeared in the middle of the 2nd century. We had thought about the Antonine phase prior to this VR modeling. Indeed, we even had a physical model constructed 20 years ago. And of course, our site architect has used various forms of CAD to recreate hypothetical reconstructions of how the building must have looked at the time. But the process of working towards a VR model really enabled us to question some of the approaches, some of the concepts of how the theatre was operating structurally, and the relationship between those various architectural elements that have been scattered across the site subsequently. It meant that we could really attempt a couple of different hypothetical reconstructions of the stage building itself, and also to provide a visualization of how the seating would have looked, given that so much of the seating itself had been robbed away in antiquity as well. So the final result was a creation of a model that had 3 viewpoints. Those viewpoints were based in the center of the orchestra. So effectively a chorus member's view, another view from the orchestra, but closer to the entranceway, the paradoi, the painted areas of which you'll see in the center here. And finally, and I think in many ways, most importantly, a view of the stage building from the seating, so i.e. the audience member's view. Now, what I'm going to show you very quickly is the 2D version of that model that we have subsequently used in a museum context numerous times. Again, hopefully this works. It is available on YouTube and through our project website if it's too clunky and it freezes. But just to give you a sense of how we're able to take a very ruined site and give us a sense of how it would have looked for a contemporary audience member at the time. So again, you'll see aspects of the imperial portraits, for example, incorporated, the various types of imported marble represented within the stage building itself, and marble flooring from the orchestra, which is only fragmentary in its preservation. So again, what's interesting and what I really want to focus on, I'm conscious I'm about to run out of time, but this concept of then the public reception of the visual representation of all of this work. We launched the VR model at in 2017 in October during an art exhibition that we actually co-curated as part of Paphos at that year being European City of Culture. And what's interesting then is amongst this idea of visual representations of the theatre from a contemporary art perspective to incorporate a VR model. And it was incredibly well received within that context. But what's interesting then is having an afterlife, for us to be able to use it as a guide for tourists and visitors to the site, to give a much more holistic representation of the theatre as it would have looked at that point in its history. We use it for team training and site induction. We've used it for innumerable school visits from various schools across Cyprus. And then I don't have any images, I'm afraid, but I've used both the VR goggles and then subsequently the 2D modelling version in various school presentations here in Australia. If you go and visit Paphos Museum, that 2D version is part of the curated display of the Roman period material. And up until it closed in 2019, the Nicholson Museum also had that video on loop as well. So one of the interesting things is that that representation of the theatre has now been seen by more people than, and both in 3D versions and in 2D versions, than the actual theatre site itself. And just to say that that relationship has been so fruitful that one of the things that I want to do, and indeed COVID has actually been the main reason we've delayed with this, but the concept is to create the 2nd century BCE variation of the theatre to show how much the building did evolve over that time frame. We're also intending to do some work in terms of capturing those paradoi, those painted entranceways that I referred to before. Again, very fragmentary, but enough elements have survived for us to be able to recreate the schema. What we now want is a visualization where audience members and performers would be able to walk on the stage and be surrounded by that same Antonine phase of painted decoration. So it's been a really collaborative and fruitful collaboration. And one of the key things that's come out of it is that I've invited Simon to actually write a chapter of the final excavation report. And I see this as a natural progression, that as another means of recording the results of the finds, this type of information needs to be captured as part of the overall documentation of an archaeological project. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. And that was a really great presentation to look into the ancient history in Cyprus. Do we have any questions from the audience? So we got Susan. Okay, so Susan is asking, they have modified.
I was responding. Yeah. I was responding to somebody else. So let's see, it's from April Herzog, who says, it would be madness to restore and then use it as a theater. What about safety, access for the disabled, right? These are all very good questions. And I just put in there that they have restored theaters from the ancient times, but that must, and then they have to do it to modern expectations, which I hand back to Craig. So like, that must be part of the issue here for you.
It is. Look, the politics aside, what's interesting is that, of course, there's been that really strong ethical consideration, and indeed various treaties in Europe signed preventing the restoration of ancient theatres. Some people might be aware that there's an example in Spain where a theatre was restored, a Roman theatre was restored, and the Spanish High Court ruled that the restoration had to be removed. It actually hasn't been, but it's interesting that there's been a complete cultural shift from the great period of restoration, which was really in that post-war period, to an era today where theatres are deemed to be better left as they are. So it's then that question of, okay, and I agree with it, I should stress it from an archaeological perspective, what's really, really interesting then is this concept of how can we present how that building would have looked to a contemporary audience who is used to seeing somewhere like Ebri-Davros and thinking that theatre should be much more holistic than you know the ruins that we have now. So this, to us, became the most obvious means of finding that engagement.
Yeah, speaking about engagement, we got a question from Tom, and he's asking whether you've considered using it to have some kind of a virtual theatrical performance?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tom, actually. It has crossed my mind. I haven't spoken to Simon about it, but it has crossed my mind. As indeed the issue of, as it appears, it's now an empty theatre. I think it's meant to be early afternoon in October, from memory, was what we decided upon in about 161 AD. That what would be good is to actually populate it with people. That, of course, was beyond my financial limitations at that point in time, but I would actually like to revisit that. And that's a really good point, Tom, because it does mean that potentially we could actually bring in that aspect that we've seen in other presentations yesterday and today of performative, and getting an indication of how ancient performances must have been seen. So that would be really interesting. Yeah, actually, the more you say that, the more, sorry, I'm going to write this down since we're finished, but yeah, watch this space.
You've got another proposal from Michael. He is asking, do you still have the source photos from 10 years ago? He would love to reproduce them with today's tech. That's a very good point, Michael. And no, we don't, because the Cypress Institute did the project, and in part why I wanted to work with Simon in this case was to take back control of those images. But having said that, I would imagine we would be able to access them from the Cypress Institute. So that'd be a really good question. Yeah.
Let me know, drop me a line. Happy to work on
it. Yeah. Have you found that with other projects though, that going back, I mean, I know you just talked before about that shift from Agisoft to reality capture, but I mean, have you found that going back to older,
especially projects that old, because they were probably done at quite a low dense cloud at that time before the depth map technology existed, or it's because compute wasn't good enough. They weren't done it even then the quality they could have done then. So and now, yes, as you just said, now we have new bits of software that do it in a better way again. And I fear so often people forget about source photos as a point of record. They are a point of record. Keep the source photos. Don't put them somewhere.
So certainly all the stuff that's been captured by Guy Hazel and Rowan Conroy in the last our last 3 seasons, we have all of that data.
Yeah, well, drop me a line, Craig.
Jude is asking, do you have any plans to populate the models with the people of the time?
Yeah, again, as I said before, it was financial was the decision, but that had actually crossed their mind. Because again, also the science of acoustics of ancient theatre, because of course the way sound travelled in the space varied depending upon not just where the actors were performing, but also other things taking place. Some people I'm sure are aware, I know Susan would be, that the Romans had all sorts of tricks, such as water bowls of water being placed in various places various places around the theatre to help amplify the acoustic sound. So what would be interesting would be to match sound then with the images as well. And I think Tom's idea of performance would be really interesting to get a sense of, does it sound differently depending upon where you're seated as well? Yeah, that's a really good idea. But yeah, beyond our resources at that point in time, but it is something we would like to revisit.